I'm here today with John Perkins, long-term member of the MG Club of St. Louis and a very experienced mechanic, and I was just getting some of that history, really wonderful stuff. And he's going to tell us today about a tune-up. It's now April in St. Louis. John, tell us about this car.
Well, this one is a 1956 MG ZA Magnette, and when I got the car, it would run on one cylinder and just barely. And in doing some diagnostic work back then, the original 1500 engine was just not powerful enough now for my liking. And with the original rear axle, the 1500 engine was just used up at around 45 or 50 miles an hour. So something had to change. And in reading about HRG Darrington and the crossflow head, I found out that Darrington actually used his 54 ZA Magnette to develop the aluminum crossflow head that's in use on a lot of B-series MGs. So I thought it was fitting to put a Darrington pattern crossflow head on my ZA.
Let's take a closer look at this crossflow head.
Yeah, first you have to ignore the dirt, because this car quite literally has been sitting for 6 months without being driven. The primer you see is because it got involved in a shunt at MG 2019 and had to be reworked, and so I haven't cleaned it yet. But regardless, you can see that carburetors are on the passenger side instead of the driver's side of the car, or the right side versus left. And on the left side, we still have the standard 3-port exhaust system like you're used to seeing for an MG. So you can see that this the carburetors are missing from the left side, replaced with some spacers, but the standard 3-port exhaust is still there. This header was one that was designed by Zero Exhaust out of the UK, and it was used on Jose Sousa's ZA Peking to Paris rally car. And when I read about that, I asked them if they would do one for me as well, and they were very happy to comply. The carburetors are a pair of HS6 carburetors that were originally set up for an MGC, but they seem to be just quite happy working on a crossflow headed MGB engine. The bottom end of this engine is a 3-main 1800 MGB, so it's a useful increase in displacement from 1500. Okay, the interesting thing is most people start the tune-up at the wrong place. But first, there are hot and cold items that have to be taken care of when the engine is cold and when it's hot. And if you reach out and touch the exhaust manifold, if it's too hot to touch, it's too hot to do the cold parts. Okay, the very first step of any tune-up while the engine's cold is to remove the radiator cap. And the whole point of removing the radiator cap is to make sure there's no pressure that could break the seal on the head gasket while you're retorquing the head. Okay? And when you're retorquing the head, you do it one stud at a time so that you don't break the seal. Let me break down the tune-up into its component parts. The way you work on the engine, because an engine is really a fancy air pump, and you're trying to optimize the air pump when you're doing a tune-up. And to optimize this air pump, you first have to get all the mechanical parts straight. And then you have to get the electrical system perfected. And finally, after the mechanical and the electrical are done, you can start working on the fuel system. Okay, the mechanical section, while the engine is cold, is when you retorque the head. And you retorque the head to make sure that all the mechanical components are in the correct relationship to each other. Then you get the engine heated up, you take it out for a drive and warm it up. And then, while the engine is hot, you can drain the oil, change the oil filter, and while that's going on, you can remove the spark plugs and adjust the valves to their hot lash setting. When we're talking about the electrical system, for a tune-up, the electrical system really consists of the distributor and the coil, and making sure that the points are operating correctly, that they are adjusted to the correct gap, and that the dwell angle is correct, and that you have the total timing. That is, while the engine is revved up to the point where maximum advance has occurred, you check that maximum advance is where your distributor is set, not the idle, at speed. Finally, you adjust, you start working on the fuel system and make sure that the carburetor dampers move freely, the dampers are correctly filled with oil, that you optimize the fuel mixture, and you adjust and balance the carbs for proper idle at the proper mixture. It needs to be done in this order: mechanical, electrical, and fuel. Okay, I've already retorqued this head before, but let me show you on one stud how this operation needs to be done. You loosen it up, and the reason you're loosening that nut is you're trying to make sure that the nut turns freely on the fine threads of the stud. You can see how that turns. The nut is free. If the stud comes loose with the nut, pull it all the way out and remove the nut, clean the threads, because the block side of the stud is coarse threads, the nut side is fine threads. If you try to torque the head with the coarse threads, the clamping force will not be the same, and you'll have uneven torque or uneven clamping force on the head, and that will lead to head gasket failures. But you do the studs one at a time.
All right, so it looks like you're ready at this point to go ahead and torque that back up. Why don't you tell us how you're going to do that in the sequence and what you look for?
Well, the whole point of retorquing the head cold is, and I'm not just doing the one bolt. I showed you the one bolt to show you about the stud, but all the bolts have been retorqued in the proper torque pattern that's listed in the shop manual or your Haynes manual, whichever you have, and then it's clicked. They're all torqued and they're all ready to go. We do this before we do the cold lash, because the cold valve adjustment is dependent on the head being stable and the rocker arms being stable before we do them.
Well, let me ask you, when you're doing the retorquing the head, would you loosen up each of the bolts first? Because you loosen that one up. So you'll loosen them up to make sure that the coarse threads are all the way down. You're not pulling a bolt out.
Exactly.
Those sorts of things.
Exactly. You always loosen them first to make sure that only the nut on the fine threads of the stud is moving. Mm-hmm. And then if you have any resistance, you pull it apart, clean the threads, and make sure it's nice and easy before you try to torque it, because if the threads are damaged or dirty, you won't get an accurate torque. If the coarse threads are moving and not the fine threads, you won't get an accurate clamping force.
So let me ask you this, would you have them all loose, or would you do one at a time?
No, one at a time. That way you don't compromise the seal on the head.
Excellent. All right, thanks, John. There we go. Go ahead and line it up. Well, this is a real advantage to the Magnette. Looks like you could set the crankshaft where you want it, right from the front crank.
Absolutely. That's when I built up this 1800 MGB engine, it was just simply a matter of getting a crankshaft nut for an MGA. Went right in the stock Magnette crank works fine.
That's wonderful.
Yep. So when you're adjusting the valves on a 4-cylinder engine, there's something called the rule of nines. Okay? So whichever valves are fully open, and right now what you're seeing is number 6 and number 8 are fully open. That means we can adjust 1 and 3. And in my case, this engine has a non-stock camshaft in it. So instead of adjusting it to 13 thousandths cold or 15 thousandths hot, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, I have to do 12 thousandths cold on the intake and 16 thousandths cold on the exhaust. So on an MGB, the valves are exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust, exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust. Okay? So with 6 and 8 down, number 3 is loose and number 1 is loose. 1 and 8 is 9, 3 and 6. Okay. So the process is real straightforward. You get your favorite 1/2 inch box wrench or ring spanner if you're English. And I always like to make sure, because this one is a little bit stuck, there we go, make sure that the nut is loose from the stud or the adjuster screw, so I can make sure to get a good adjustment. And what you want is be able to move the feeler gauge in and out very smoothly and not feel any clearance when you try rocking the valve manually. Once you get that set, you see where the angle that's at. I'm going to try to hold that angle when I tighten the lock nut up so I don't lose that setting. There we go. And there we go. And since my intake is 12 thousandths cold, well, that one's already real good just the way it is. And by the way, when you're adjusting valves, yes, sometimes they can be right. All right, so I've just run the valves with the cold setting, and the reason I did that was I haven't run this engine in a long time. In all reality, what you want is a hot lash set, because the hot lash is more accurate than a cold lash. The different parts of the engine will expand at different rates, and it will affect what the cold lash setting was.
So by hot lash, you indicate that you're going to use the hot valve setting for the valve clearance.
Exactly. And if you don't know what the hot valve setting is on an MG B or B series engine, cold setting plus 2 thousandths will get you a hot lash that's real accurate.
Okay. Because
of the size of the engine. So right now we would be at the point where we've retorqued the head cold, we've cold lashed it so that we know what the valve settings are. We take the car out for a drive, get it to good operating temperature, and the other side benefit of doing that is when you've run the engine up to operating temperature and slide back into your driveway and shut it off, you'll be able to read the spark plugs accurately when we get to the electrical part of this job.
Okay, so let's assume that we take it out for a drive and we'll come back.
Exactly.